Welcome everybody back for a special episode of BQ Chats. This is what I call a director dialogue. Really excited to have Brother Faubert, our National Senior Bible Quizzing Director, on tonight to have some Bible quizzing discussion, ask him some questions, and just really looking forward to the conversation. Brother Faubert, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. Always good to be back.
Yeah, we've had you on quite a few times, and it's always a pleasure. So what I wanted today, I always have questions in quiz practice, especially when doing practice quizzes, where there's a certain question and either the quizzer doesn't finish it quite like on the paper or answers it in a way that's not quite what's on the paper. And I've been coaching for 13 years now, and I feel like I've got a pretty good understanding, and that's with some help along the way. But there's still plenty of times that I'm just like, I don't know what the quizmaster would do in this situation. I can typically tell the quizzers what they could have done differently to get a more sure, correct call. But there are some situations where I'm just like, I don't know. I feel like this is a quizmaster discretion kind of things. Now you are and you made it. Would you disagree with that?
Well, our habit in practice was, if it's not full and complete in the way it should be answered, you were wrong.
That is probably a good practice method, right?
Yeah. Don't allow any wiggle room and to sort of bad habits to creep in, and you sort of guard against it. But I still understand that those things do crop up. Sure.
Well, there comes a discussion of like best practices versus truly right or wrong, right? Truly incorrect or correct. So we can get into some of that today. So I'm excited to get started. The first one I have for you, I'm gonna pull up my slide over here.
Mm-hmm.
The first one I have for you today. Is it okay as a question? I write practice questions. Really enjoy doing it. I'm really enjoying writing on doctrine. But this is something that I think we're going to possibly see pop up this year, and I wanted to get your perspective on it. So, as a question writer, is it okay to include context in a question that isn't in our study? And what I mean by that, I have some examples. Here's a 10-point question. Referring to Saul, Acts chapter 9 records he said what? Now, in our study this year, we don't have a verse in Acts chapter 9 that names Saul. And the verse that I'm referring to just says he. It doesn't actually name Saul. So, as a question writer, and I'm saying this more for coaches and quizzers to understand, what's okay to contest, right? Is it okay to contest and say, hey, that's not in the chapter, so you can't write that? That's an invalid question. What is your perspective on this?
I don't have a problem including expository information that contextualizes the question. It needs to be used judiciously by the question writer. It shouldn't insert like some sort of question like, what are they talking about, or like maybe some extra biblical term or something that they're unfamiliar with. It should be provided. It should be provided early on in the question, and so as to it's fully sort of drawn out and not at a point of interruption or anything like that as well. So, and I generally, if it's something that is more well known or generally accepted, then all the better. You're not going to necessarily run into cases where, you said that that's referring to Christ, or in this case, referring to Saul. Should they know that, or would they know that? If in doubt, I'm not going to include it, or I may make the question that much more specific, right? Referring to Saul in verse 5 of Acts chapter 9 or something like that.
Gotcha.
Pins it down. Yeah.
Now, and then the second example here in Matthew chapter 28, Jesus said what? Now, I think we expect our quizzers to a certain point to understand that Matthew chapter 28 verse 19 was spoken by Jesus. Would I be correct with that? Now, we don't have a verse, we don't have the verses around Matthew 28:19 to kind of say Jesus, and then go all the way down to verse 19. But saying in Matthew chapter 28, Jesus said what? Do you see any issue with that at all?
Well, so in Matthew 28, Jesus said, that is a point of interruption.
Mm-hmm.
I would hope that they would know that that's referring to Jesus. I may hedge against it, though. Referring to Jesus in our verses of Matthew chapter 28, he said what?
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't necessarily say it's a point of contest or one that would be granted. It's just a matter of how can I, what I call contest proof the question.
Right.
I don't want to give them any reason to stand on their feet and say, hey, that's, so I'll provide the context, but then sort of pin it down to eliminate the chance of them getting out of their chair.
Now, I remember I got to call out my best friend, Eric Forbes. I believe he was writing back, and I think it was 2019 for a tournament, and I think he had referring to Cyrus in Isaiah, if I recall, and there was kind of a hubbub about it. There were some people that were kind of upset about it, and I didn't like it personally because Cyrus isn't in our study. That takes quite the deep dive into the context around some verses that we're learning. So you would say, I mean, I think you would agree that question writers shouldn't include that, but if a question writer did, do quizzers coaches have any leg to stand on as far as a contest would go?
Not really. I mean, it is at the end of the day the question writer's prerogative. That would be an example where if a quizzer hears that, they would automatically, their sort of thought process would be interrupted to say, what, who? Like,
right.
And the sort of their flow broken, just because a question could be written better or more to the quizzer's advantage doesn't automatically make it invalid.
Right.
So.
Okay. Thank you for that. All right, we're going to move on to our next question. This just happened in a practice I was in recently, and I made a decision. I think I know what the correct call is, but I think it's interesting to discuss it and to kind of have an answer from you, sir. So, can a quizzer repeat part of the question? There's probably a few different examples of this, but one example would be a 3-part like this one. Which verse of the Old Testament refers to sitting where and walking where? And then a quizzer could interrupt that maybe on sitting, right? Which verse of the Old Testament refers to sitting where? And then they could say, and walking where? And they could forget that or not have quite been focused at the beginning of the question and heard the which verse. And then they could say, and what is this verse? So we have which verse and what is this verse at the end? Technically making this a 4-part question. But is there any argument to saying, well, they were just repeating a question that's already there? Is still only 3 parts to this question. There's still only 3 answers.
Well, the argument can be made. You can argue just about anything, but the onus is on the quizzer. In this case, you can go back. In fact, I encourage quizzers and please, coaches, make it a habit in your practice for them to go back and say the last few words, even if that includes a question that's already been mentioned. In that case, it would be obvious. Let's say the question was sitting where, and they interrupted, and they went back and said sitting where and walking where they're repeating the question. Nobody's under the impression that now you're making this a 5-part question, by repeating what's there. However, that to me is sort of a bridge too far, where it's out of the order. It's you're sort of tacking on something already at the end. You think that it's a different question, and so the quizzer has sort of injected the ambiguity,
right?
Which verse versus what is this verse? Do you think these are different questions? Well, that ambiguity is that the onus is on the quizzer. So in this example here, I would unfortunately rule them incorrect if they did that. Yeah.
I actually just thought of another thing that does happen from time to time, and I feel like this is typically called correct if everything is in order. But what I have seen is, let's say there's a question that's like, who, as recorded in Matthew chapter blah verse blah, kicked a chair. Let's just say that's the question. Okay, who kicked a chair? Who, according to this verse, kicked a chair? But they get who, according to this verse, kicked, and they interrupt, and they say, who kicked the chair? So they went back and repeated part of the question, but they took the who that came before the reference, left the reference out of what they were repeating, and then picked up at the verb after the reference was given. Do you see any issue with that, where you're going back to the beginning of the question and leaving stuff out?
As long as the essence of the question is maintained, it may be that there's only one person that kicked a chair in that chapter. So, the verse reference was added by the writer as sort of an aid, but not required, right, to pin it to that verse.
Oh,
So
that's
in that
interesting.
case, you wouldn't necessarily. Now, if they interrupted, like in the middle of, according to well, you've got to give the chapter, then you can't just go back and leave it out.
Okay.
And right.
So that's interesting. So I didn't really think of it that way, where if the quizzer goes back and starts at the beginning and makes the question, even though the quizmaster said the reference, if the quizmaster goes back before the reference and leaves it out, this is treated as if this question doesn't have a reference on it and is only valid if that's unique to that verse.
Right. If the essence of the question has been maintained. Now, if it opens it up to the chapter and you got to identify a pronoun, or you got to, then that's, again, the quizzer has sort of opened this up, and the onus is on them in that case. So
that's interesting. Yeah. I didn't think of it opening it up, like you going back and leaving it out kind of voided what the quizmaster had already said. That's interesting. Okay.
Well, only in the case where it is not essential to begin with.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
I think you may have some questions upcoming about trailing information.
Yes.
And that's another type where if it's included, okay. If it's non-essential information to the correct completion of the question, then, does the quizzer actually need to include it?
Well,
not really.
Well, we'll get into this, but I
Sure.
think some people may have a different interpretation of what's essential, possibly. But I'd love to hear your perspective on it. And all right, we're going to go to the next one. So, what would your ruling be for these examples? These were actually submitted by a coach to me. Someone emailed me with a couple questions, and I was like, these are good things to ask. These are things that some less experienced, new to senior quizzing coaches have, and so I'd like to talk to you about them. So the first one was, our verses of study refer to what kind of sword? So the quizzer in practice said two-edged sword, or maybe a two-edged sword, or something like that. So is that word any essential to the answer of this question?
So let me try to answer this in multiple layers here. If you're in practice, you require this from your quizzers every time.
Yes.
If I'm in a quiz and they said two-edged sword, I will continue to look at them and give them their full 30 seconds to give me as complete an answer as possible, not only for their sake, but it limits the other team from contesting as well.
Right.
Right. So I want to just keep things moving along. So I'm going to give them their full 30 seconds to make this as complete as possible.
That's a good segue into, do you encourage quizmasters to give quizzers their full 30 seconds? Because I've seen quite a bit over the last few years where a quizmaster has to void and replace a question after a contest because they didn't give their full 30 seconds to a quizzer. So, I mean,
sometimes that's the quizmaster is just relying on what's on the page.
Mm-hmm.
And so the quizzer gives what's on his page. They count him or her correct, and so they're ready to move on when what's on the page may not be complete. So sometimes that's the case. Sometimes they feel that, okay, well, that's satisfactory, and they're moved on. But after a contest, they change their mind and grant the contest. I feel like in these instances, I'm going to give the quizzer every opportunity to make as complete an answer as possible. I wouldn't necessarily give, every time give the full 30 seconds, right? If it was what weapon is named in the Hebrews,
Mm-hmm.
the 4:12, it's sword, okay, sword of the Spirit, whatever. All right, I don't need to wait another 25 seconds to verify that they're finished or whatever. So,
right. Okay.
So part of the challenge with words like any and all is that they can, and I'll try not to go into an English lesson. I don't have a degree in English, and I don't consider myself an expert necessarily. But these words can be used in different forms of grammar.
Mm-hmm.
So in this case, both of them are being used as adjectives in this case. So as an adjective, you want to include everything that modifies, in this case, a two-edged sword, any two-edged sword. But any and all can also be used as pronouns.
Mm-hmm.
So in those cases, it may be that you don't need to include it because maybe the pronoun's already been identified in the question or something like this. So these words that can have multiple uses within English grammar can become a bit of a sticking point as to,
Gotcha.
oh, do I need it? Do I not need it? I mean, I hate to hedge, but many times it does depend on the context of the question.
So in
both of these,
in this context, I'm curious, what would you say?
I would give the quizzer the full 30 seconds. I would trust that given the nature of these questions that they would go back and give me the complete answer. If they didn't, I would likely talk it over with the judges because my initial thought would be I would expect it, right? Certainly any two-edged sword to say, I don't know, there's some essence, I believe, that's captured within that to say that if the answer was a two-edged sword, right? Well, in this case, our verse of study referred to what kind of sword? A two-edged sword.
So if it was like, what is the word of God sharper than, that may make that any more important.
Yes, exactly. So there's a good example of where, okay, now that's a slightly different question. Based on that question, absolutely, I would require it in that case.
Right.
Right. Because it acts as an adjective, but as almost like an additional emphasis.
Right.
Right.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Similarly, all the people, there's an emphasis there that's added to it. It's kind of like, I don't know, to say the police showed up versus all the police showed up. Mm-hmm. Well, that's a descriptor of who it is. So you want to include that descriptor, right?
Right.
I ate the pie. I ate all the pie. I mean, there's a big difference at Thanksgiving if you ate the pie or all the pie, right?
Right. I agree.
So,
okay.
You might have some people who are upset with you if you ate all the pie.
I do feel like the second example, the all is essential. I definitely would feel that way. The first one I didn't really feel like it was in this example, but the other example, it makes a lot of sense that it would definitely be required. But in this case, what kind of sword? I don't think the
I think you could probably get right. You could get by with two-edged in that case, I think.
Gotcha. Yeah. That makes perfect sense. Thank you. Okay.
But is a quizzer going to go through all of those sort of mental calisthenics in the moment?
Probably not.
Don't bother. Just say any two-edged sword.
Absolutely.
Every time. Yeah.
Absolutely. Best practice, give complete information. Go back and give more if you were looked at for more, prompted for more information. 100%. And coaches, hold your quizzers to a high standard in practice so that that's a habit. Okay. Moving on. Can quizzers flip this? So flipping is the act of taking something that is either in the question and making it putting in the answer, or in the answer and putting in the question. For instance, if I said kicked what and the question said did what, kicked is now in the answer instead of the question, right? We're flipping that verb from the answer to the question. So in this case, verse 8 of Deuteronomy chapter 6 records, thou shalt do what, and they shall be what. So what if a quizzer says be as what? And I guess what kind of makes it interesting to me is as is a preposition, I believe. And is it essential to the answer either way? They shall be what? Frontlets between thine eyes, figuratively, right? Or they shall be as what? Frontlets between thine eyes. So that's the question. This is why I was kind of interested to talk to you about this one.
I would say 9 times out of 10, no. I would have to go back and probably look and do some quick research. They shall be. I mean, we know that in Jewish culture, they actually had, frontlets that they took this very literally, rather than be as frontlets between the eyes. So I would have to go back and just see what the text said.
So I'm curious about that. I'm curious about that process. Like this happens to you, and so you do some research. Do you look at it in the Hebrew?
So I would pull up. I've got a Bible with Strong's on
Strong's
it.
Concordance.
So yeah, and Strong's it's not the be all and end all. But for a quick reference point, it's certainly useful. Yeah.
It's okay. We can
let me pull this up.
I'm interested in that process, because insight into that would, I think, help coaches be able to kind of get into more of that that mindset when in practices, possibly, just to kind of. I think it helps us as coaches to kind of understand how to think through this.
Barring that, I usually look at use Strong's just for like the definition maybe of a word or something, because sometimes in the KJV two different English words are used, but you look at the Strong's and it's the same word in the original. Mm-hmm. So it's hard to say that they're not in essence the same thing.
Right.
In this case, I would likely pull up multiple translations, and I've got a Bible app that I can just quickly switch between the translations. I mean, the ones that I'm pulling up here real quick all include the as part of their text as well. Mm-hmm. So based on that, I would likely say that you cannot flip in this case.
Because it is essential to the answer of be what you're saying. Like, I can't say they shall be what and say frontlets between thine eyes.
Right.
Okay. So that's interesting. So we can't. On our last director dialogue we did last year, you said that there are sometimes prepositions that are not essential. So like, especially with wheres, like sometimes they are, but sometimes like Jesus went where, or Jesus dwelt where? In Jerusalem, versus saying just Jerusalem.
Well, even then, you say Jesus dwelt Jerusalem. Jesus dwelt. Now do you mean that he dwelt in Jerusalem? Do you mean he dwelt by Jerusalem, around Jerusalem? So you're kind of leaving that hanging and
I, I,
you're relying
I
on
guess
the
my
quiz
question would
master
be,
to interpret.
sorry, I'm sorry. My question would, if the quizzer said in what instead of where, then the in is flipped. So the answer for where could be Jerusalem. Jesus dwelt where? Jerusalem. Jesus dwelt in where? In what? Jerusalem.
Yeah, generally in instances like that, I'm going to ring them up,
Okay.
unfortunately. Um, so my rule of thumb is if the verb implies the preposition, so entered into Jerusalem,
Okay.
entered Jerusalem,
Okay.
whether the preposition is in the question or the answer, I can remove it entirely. It means the same thing. I've
Okay.
got no gap. It's still correct grammar. There's nothing lost in that. I don't have to imply. Well, imply the preposition? It's just so entered is sort of the example that I typically use because that
Gotcha.
implies, yeah, the preposition.
That makes sense. 100%. That makes a lot of sense. Coming back to this question, we've talked about it from a quizzer perspective. As a writer perspective, I'm curious if this is one you would write it one way or the other, or you would avoid it. I'm just kind of not trying to get spoilers for your question writing at nationals, but I'm kind of curious about your concept of it. On do you think that it's a better habit as a writer to do the do what and pair it with a be what, because those are both the high level, I call them like the high verbs.
Yeah. Well,
Or
you've got the parallel structure, right? The verb question.
right,
Right? Do what, be what.
right.
So yes, that's the way I would write it. And if a quizzer asks it be as what, then they've broken the pattern, however slight.
Okay.
Um, this is a case where if they do that and I reread it, I'll almost always get the quizzer is like sort of nodding their head, like kicking themselves that yes, that is the better question to ask.
Gotcha. Perfect. Thank you. All right, moving on. Um, Sometimes it can be confusing on if a reference is necessary. Now, as a question writer myself, I like to try to, if there's any question at all in my mind, I like to just put the reference on the end of a question. Now, I feel like you try to leave the reference off when possible. I feel like I don't know if you hedge one way or another, but um, if I compare my questions to yours, I feel like you leave the reference off more often. And typically when you do that, I trust that you have done the work to know that this is unique and you don't need the reference for it. But when I'm just like not 100% sure, I just put the reference on there. But then what happens is in practice at a tournament, um, a quizzer leaves the reference off, and then it's a question of, and just because a question writer puts the reference on the question doesn't mean it's necessary. Correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So I had an example. Joshua did what three things as recorded in Joshua chapter 24 verse 26. So this was another question that was sent to me by a coach. So the only other verse besides Joshua 24:26, which is what verse this question is coming out of, is Joshua 1:8. This book of the law shall not depart out of thy mouth, but thou shalt meditate therein day and night, that thou mayest observe to do according to all that's written therein. So it's not anything that Joshua did, but it is instruction to Joshua in this case.
Well, the question is rather uh, open-ended without the reference. I mean, if I were a quizzer, I would contest and say, well, Joshua spoke the words in Joshua 1:8, so that's something that he did. Do we think that Joshua did not meditate, or he did not also observe, right? That he did not make his way prosperous? By implication, then he did more than three things. So Yeah, I would say that that reference is necessary in this case.
Okay. Now, that's it. That is interesting. But even if you were like, no, that's fine, we still would say, as coaches, make your quizzers put the reference on it, of course. But
Sure.
so that is interesting that even like, so you would argue that the implication, it doesn't say he did them, but it's like you think that's a strong contest. If someone, if you called it one way and someone said, well, are you saying that he didn't meditate? Are you saying that he didn't observe? Okay.
I mean, yeah. I as a question writer, now sometimes quizzers stand-up contests just either they're frustrated or they're getting out of sorts or they need a timeout. They're going to use the contest as a timeout. But as a writer, I feel that if I've left the door open for them to stand at all, then I've already uh, failed to write that question as well as it probably could have been written. So this is a case, and certainly if they bring down a contest, even if it's denied, if it's a strong contest that's going to give us a lot of pause and deliberation, then okay, I probably shouldn't have written the question that way to begin with to open the door that way.
Right. Okay. Thank you. All right. Next question. About the Lord's words, Jeremiah said what in verse 16 of Jeremiah chapter 15? So this is in the essence conversation. So I haven't read some possible ways that a quizzer could finish or answer this question. Thought it would be a little bit of fun. Like, what is essence here? So about the Lord's words, Jeremiah said what? Leaving off the reference. That's not really an essence issue. It's more of a scope issue. But do you think there's any issue with leaving off the reference in this case? I'm pulling it up right now.
Well, I mean, Jeremiah 20, verse 9, right? But his word was in mine heart as a burning fire, shut my bones. I was weary with forbearing and could not stay.
So that's about the Lord's words. That makes it an issue.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's what we have to do. We would have to look at any place where Jeremiah is speaking, and if it has anything to do at all with the Lord's words, it's wrong.
Well, and pretty much not everything in the book of Jeremiah, but most of what is written, he received from the Lord. Mm-hmm. So, right?
Right.
Jeremiah chapter 30, right? The word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord saying, thus speaketh the Lord God of Israel. Well, that's the word of the Lord to Jeremiah. So
it's about the Lord's words.
Yeah. Right.
Okay.
So anyway.
Okay. So what about this? What about changing it from Jeremiah said what in verse 16 of Jeremiah chapter 15 to Jeremiah chapter 15 verse 16 records what?
I think as long
now this is the entire verse. Thy words were found in 90 deep. It doesn't say Jeremiah said anything like that.
Right. And that is key. There's no Jeremiah said. It's just so you're sort of counting on that. He could have cried it or,
right.
So I don't think I'd have a problem in this case simply because what words of Jeremiah are recorded?
Right. Right.
Is that not the same as said what?
Right.
So what is recorded? So if you sort of take that sort of step-by-step approach, well, if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C.
Right. And in this case, the answers are exactly the same. You can't argue that one needs more or less information than the other.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. And that's probably like the first step, right? Like, does it change the answer in any way? No.
Yes.
Then there's all that, but that just because the answer doesn't change doesn't mean the question is indifferent.
That's correct.
So first thing I would,
at the same time, I don't feel it's fair to require quizzers to necessarily be mind readers to know, well, it has to be said what, even though the word said is not actually within the verse, right? There's got to be.
So I wrote the question up top, and I wrote it feeling like if they interrupt where they should and they say Jeremiah chapter 15 verse 16 records what, they're fine. Maybe I shouldn't write the one up top. Maybe I should just stick to the records what. But the only reason I would write that is because I feel like if they hit at a good spot and they finish either way, then they're fine.
Well, yeah. I
And
mean,
maybe
the
that's
clue is the clue is the term words, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the quizzer's got to be really listening sharp and know their stuff, right?
Right.
Thy words were found.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the sort of clue or the tip off there.
Right.
That this is the verse that you're going to, and that hopefully they do include the verse reference. Otherwise, they're up the creek. But
right. Now, lastly, I thought this would be fun. So if the quizzer, maybe they don't interrupt it, maybe it's a reread, and they say, your words were found, and I ate them, and your word was the joy and rejoicing of my heart, because by your name I am called, Lord God of hosts. So, definitely not right on a quote, but do you see any essence issues here?
No, I don't think so.
So, the only things that need to be quoted are quotation questions, correct?
Correct. Quotation type questions, right? Quotation completion, and a cross-reference quotation.
Yes.
Everything else, essence. Yeah. Now, again, it's always best to stick in the text. Don't get in the habit, because you'll get it right the first 4 times and then get burned because, well, that little word, like any or all within the context of this question,
right,
may infuse a bit of essence there that is lost if you don't include it.
Gotcha. Thank you. All right. Next question I got for you. This is another essence thing. Speaking of Joseph, the angel said, thou shalt call his name what? Why? As recorded in Matthew chapter 1, verse 21. Jesus, for he shall save his people from their sins. So, one question I had is there an issue saying for what instead of why? If you change, thou shalt call his name what? For what? And I get the argument for that being okay that I would make would be thou shalt call his name what? Jesus. Why? He will save his people from their sins. Is that for necessary for the answer either way?
Well, I think my bigger concern would be that for what you sort of leave it hanging, right? The quizzer would be relying upon the quizmaster to understand what comes after the for what. For what reason?
For what reason?
For what purpose?
Mm-hmm.
Like you have to give me that so that I understand that you understand, right?
Okay.
For what? But so in this case, now it just so happens that the for what reason, that phrase, the first word is also found in the text,
right?
But what if it was, thou shalt call his name what? To what end? Thou shalt call his name what? Due to what reason?
Okay.
There are a lot of ways that you can phrase it to get to why.
Right.
In this case, the for what, it just happens that it's the same as the for in the text. It's not necessarily that you're pulling or replacing one from the other. But you can't just leave it hanging for what, right? It's got to be for what reason or for what purpose, for what design. I don't know.
So you can flip. You would say, as long as it is a purpose, you can flip any why to for what reason, for what purpose. Like that is in essence saying why, saying for what reason is the same thing.
Yeah.
It's another way to
There
say the
was a
same question.
time, yeah, there was a time years ago that they were more particular about that. But there's lots of words that imply a why, right? That, for, lest, because, obviously, as I said, due to, or just the word to,
Right.
right? So there's lots of words. Again, uh, I don't really see it as flipping there and moving one from the other. It's just a rephrasing of why.
Okay. The other small thing, I changed the answer from "He will save his people from sin" instead of "from their sin." I don't want to spend too much time
Oh,
on that, but do you think
I
that
I hadn't noticed that. I would probably have to.
dive into that and see go to the Greek and see if there's a definition? I don't want to spend too much time on that. I just thought it would be another, what if they said "from sin" instead of "from their sins"?
Yeah, I would have to look at it, see. Again, sometimes in the English, we think that it should be a certain way, and we may be surprised when we go and look at other translations or a more literal translation or the Strong's itself.
Because I'm assuming it would be an argument of, is this verse saying from that individual's sins and not sin as a whole?
Right. Um, there certainly is a personalization to say he will save me from sin or from my sin,
Right.
right? There's an admission of culpability there. Um, so yeah, I would have to look into it.
But
Could you just say what Matthew 121 says, and we won't have a problem. We'll be on to the next question.
Exactly. Uh, well, gut reaction. I'm guessing that would be an issue, changing it from their sins to sin. It seems like there would be something, but don't make Brother Faubert get into a Strong's Concordance, guys. All right, going to the next one. Joshua wrote these words where and took a great stone and set it up where. So this is kind of a preposition flip on this first one. Now Joshua wrote these words in what? So the answer would be in the book of the law of God. Joshua wrote these words where? In the book of the law of God. Joshua wrote these words in what? The book of the law of God. Is there an issue flipping that in from the question to the answer, or vice versa?
Well, I think we already sort of touched on this, and yes, absolutely.
Okay.
In
And
this case,
okay, and then the other one on this one was set it where. This is actually something I'm curious about because I feel like it's hard for a quizzer to figure out if they should say set it up where or set it where. I feel like the up isn't necessary for set it where because it's part. I feel like the up is more how he set it up and not where he set it.
correct.
Okay.
Yes, that would be a how or a, like what direction or something like that. You could
Okay.
write the question again to capitalize on the parallelism. You could write wrote these words where, took a great stone and said it where,
Right.
and just drop the up. You don't need the up in the question. You don't need the up in the answer if
Okay.
you're just looking for the where.
Perfect. All right. Next is trailing information necessary. We touched on this a little bit earlier, but I think there comes a question for some people: is that the same question? Right? Like, what is it? Is it the same like? Even if the answers are exactly the same, there's an argument of, well, that's a different question. So in this case, according to Romans chapter 5, verse 12, what entered into the world? Now, what if a quizzer said, according to Romans chapter 5, verse 12, what entered? Is it just a matter of saying, is there only one thing that entered in Romans chapter 5, verse 12? If so, this is fine.
Well, you pinned it to a verse, so yeah. I mean, you don't need the into the world. It's a complete an accurate question to ask what entered.
Right.
Sin entered into the world, but there's not just one thing in this verse. And
Right.
death entered into the world by sin.
Right.
Right. So sin and death. But in English, what is used for both the singular and the plural. So,
Right.
yeah.
Thank goodness. All right. And then the next one would be, who will guide you into all truth? So this question doesn't have a reference on it at all. But what if a quizzer said, who will guide you, interruption, as recorded in John chapter 16, verse 13? They didn't, like, into all truth seems like it's a pretty important fact, right? It's not just that he's guiding you, it's that he's guiding us into all truth.
So you could ask who will guide you as long as there's no other form of guide, right? Guide, guided, or any synonym to that effect, like led, right? Leading, that sort of thing.
In the
And
scope of the question, which if the quizzer puts the verse on it, it would have to be in that verse.
well, correct. Or even in the study, I don't know in terms of how many times the forms of, I'd have to break out the concordance, and then I would have to, again, go look through and look for any synonyms. If they just said, who will guide you, that may in fact be enough, because if that's accurate in and of itself, um, you're probably playing with fire again.
Right. But if you put the reference on it, you feel like that as long as there's nothing in the verse that you could say could be an issue, then which we have the verse right here, which it doesn't seem like there would be any synonyms or any other forms of guide. So who will guide you, as recorded in John chapter 16, verse 13, should be fine.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. So can you think of an example where trailing information would be necessary? Okay, I can think of it's not really, this isn't so much trailing information, but I always tell my quizzers, sometimes 20-point direct, and it's a why. And there's a lot of words that come before the why in the question. And this is kind of building the reason for the why. I don't know what the other side of the why is. Does that make sense? Like all the words in the question before the why, that's kind of setting up this why. I guess this is the thing that's happening or something like that. Does that make sense?
Okay.
So sorry. If a quizzer only gives part of that and then jumps to the why and skips to the why, that could be considered, trailing information, but I would think that the entire concept of the why needs to be given in the question for it to be valid. I wish I had an example of this. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I know what you're referring to. I would have to look into the text itself.
Right.
I can't give a blanket answer there. In some cases, all of that context or exposition prior to the why, it's mutually inclusive. So it's dependent upon each other. So you cannot just give part of it and then ask why. You've got to give all of it. In other cases, it's more like a series of things, and the why would apply to each of them individually.
Right.
And so maybe you can ask just this and why, right?
Okay.
So it really depends on the verse and what's trying to be communicated there.
Got it. Perfect.
To address the trailing information, many times it's not necessary, and it actually can impede the quizzer because they interrupt and they're thinking, well, and then I say interruption, they're like, but that I don't need anything more. That's a complete question of itself. What other additional information could there be? Right. And they sort of have to run the verse through their mind. And most of the time they'll pull it out. But it can be a bit of an impediment. The times that you do need it. So to use the second example here, who will guide you into all truth? If there was another verse that referred to somebody being guided into Jerusalem, well, you would need who will guide you into all truth to differentiate that, right? So that is the qualifying information that is essential to identifying this question and answer.
Yes. Now, if there was another verse that said, "Who will guide you into Jerusalem?" But a quizzer interrupted and said, "Who will guide you according to John 16:13?" Then they've narrowed it down and they're safe.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah,
perfect. Okay. Next, the use of mentions. This is done by question writers or by quizzers that interrupt. This is typically, I find, on quotation questions. This is where I would see this potentially be an issue the most. So this year, this is like the big example that always comes to my mind. One verse of study mentions the cross. Quote this verse. Now, there is only one verse in our study this year that contains the word cross, but I would argue that 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 24 says, "Who his own self bare our sins in his own body on the tree," referring to what is the tree? The tree is the cross. So I think that we both, I know what you're going to say for this one, that this is an issue. But I'm kind of curious to get your take on mentions and kind of where the line is as far as mentions, if a quizzer uses that or if a question writer uses that.
just be sure you've done your homework.
Okay.
That's a great example. Even I would say any verse that refers to, Jesus being crucified
is mentioning the cross.
It is. Yep.
Okay. Now, this is a contest I had in 2019. By me, I mean my quizzer Avery Wilson had this contest, not in your session, and I thought it was an interesting contest because it was I'm kind of curious what you think. It was quote the only verse in which the slaughter, and the quizzer interrupted and said, "is mentioned," and I think that's probably what you had on that. I imagine that's what you had on the paper, being how it was written. It doesn't matter because that's how the quizzer finished it. And Avery contested and said, well, the slaughter, you could say that the crucifixion was the slaughter of Jesus, which is what he was brought as a lamb to the slaughter. That's how he was brought. But that slaughter is kind of, also you could say that, who his own self bare our sins in his own body on the tree is the slaughter of Jesus on the cross. So I'm curious how far that mentions conceptually you could take that.
That sounds like a pretty strong contest to me.
Okay.
It's very broad. It's, refers to, mentions, trying to think, describes is a little more specific to an actual description of something. But yeah. And in the case where I may be unsure, I'll revert to sort of contains the word. And
right.
Maybe that's how I should have written that question in 2019, contains the word slaughter, to avoid, again, even the contest. Yeah.
I wasn't trying to make you change the question, but that was, I felt. Sorry,
it's challenging as a writer to think of every permutation, especially in this year's study, right? Because you've got verses from the Old Testament that are prophesying looking forward. And this was a great example from Isaiah 53, looking forward into the New Testament. So you've got a lot of connections that way, and words and symbolism that might automatically spring to mind.
Right. Interesting. Okay. Well, Avery will be really excited to hear that it was a good contest. I will let him know. All right. All right. Moving on. Could there be instances where flipping Lord, God, or Father is an issue? I bring this up because Avery, once again, was counted wrong one time for saying God instead of Lord or Lord instead of God, and he has never forgotten it. He's like, I can't believe they called me wrong for saying God instead of Lord, or whatever it was. And I feel like there could potentially be some instances where it is an issue, but there's a lot of cases where it's not an issue. So just kind of wanted to hear your take on that.
And so generally in the Old Testament, if, as is the example here in Isaiah 34, if it's capital O, capital R, capital L, O, R, D, then we'll use that synonymously with God. Right? This is meant to take the place, the name of God, Yahweh. And so, yeah, we'll accept that rather than digging into the tetragrammaton and all those big $100 words. I don't even know if I said it correctly, but anyway. So yeah, in the Old Testament, you're typically pretty safe unless it's like, referring to a person as, my Lord or something like that. That's obviously not a reference to God.
Right.
In the New Testament, it can be a little more tricky. You don't have to read much of Paul to identify that he refers to Jesus as Lord, but not in the same context in which he is describing God in his infinity. So those contexts really have to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. As a question writer, I try to set those up in advance so that we're not going to trip up the quizzer. I'm not requiring them to say Lord when it might be God or vice versa.
Okay, so the answer is case by case, more likely an issue in the New Testament. So there are cases where it's talking about the man Christ Jesus being Lord and not God the Father. Okay, perfect. So case by case, try to say what's in the verse or in the context of the area. But I do like, as you said, writing it in a way that it's not so much an issue. Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Next, is it okay to write the question, what is what? And I know the answer to this already, but I think this is an interesting thing that it is. So the example would be Psalms 119, 140. It is really tempting on this verse to write, what is what? Therefore, who doeth what? But I believe there's an issue with saying what is what.
Yes. Don't do it.
Now, if a quizzer hears that type of question, what should their argument be for why that's invalid?
So what is what? You're basically creating an equivalency, right? Think of it like a math equation with an equal sign, right? So if what is on the left-hand side equals what is on the right-hand side, then you can flip those and they'd still be equal.
You can say very pure is the word.
That's correct.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So now I've got two question words that can accept either answer. That's invalid.
Okay. Now, if the question was like, what is very what, which I cringe at that a lot. Now, why that feels wrong, but I can't like put into words why that's wrong to write what is very what.
So typically we're including the noun with its descriptors.
Right.
Right. And you're not separating the two. Yeah. I would never write it that way. I don't. If somebody chose to write it that way, it wouldn't necessarily make it an invalid question. But it's just awkward use of the English.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. Perfect. Thank you. I agree. All right. Next. Now, the rule book tells us that quizzers cannot flip the negative. And what does that mean? It's if it said, Jesus did not throw the table, and you said Jesus did what? Did not throw the table. And the question said Jesus did not do what? You can't flip that not from the question to the answer, just like we were talking about earlier with prepositions and verbs. So, but my question was, can a question writer kind of flip that negative and ask a positive did what when the verse is saying not what? And the reason I like this question for the pattern's sake. But I'm curious if it's an issue. And this is me being vulnerable here in front of the whole world, Brother Faubert. So don't laugh. Don't laugh at me too hard. All right.
I'm already smiling.
2 Corinthians chapter 5 refers to God doing what unto himself, doing what unto them, and doing what unto us. But the problem I see with my own, self reflection here, doing what unto them, the answer to that would be not imputing their trespasses. Is that an issue?
The short answer is yes.
Okay.
Because you're asking, what is he doing unto them? The verse doesn't tell you what he is doing unto them. It's telling you what he's not doing, but it does not say what he's doing.
Okay. I am giving you guys contest ammunition here. I'm going to have to rewrite this question later. But so if a quizzer said, 2 Corinthians chapter 5 refers to God doing what unto himself, not doing what unto them, and doing what unto us, but the question writer wrote what I wrote, you have a contest to say a question writer cannot ask what they did when in fact the verse is saying what they did not do.
Correct.
Because the argument would be like, well, he didn't impute their trespasses unto them, which you could say implies that he forgave them. That's what he did, or something like that. But that's not enough of an argument.
Not in this case. So sometimes in the KJV text, there's sort of there's a sort of figure of speech where they'll use the negative to imply the positive.
Okay.
Like, he gave him no little amount of money.
Right. Okay.
Right. He gave him what? No little amount of money. That means he gave him a lot of money.
Right.
Right. So they're using the negative to imply the so in that case, you wouldn't say, what didn't he give him? Because again, he did give him something.
Right.
And so in those cases, you right, while the negative is included, you would actually write it as the positive. What did he give him? No little amount of money.
Perfect. Okay. All right. So don't do that as a question writer, and contest as a quizzer if you see something like that in the future. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now this is one that we had a text message discussion with Eric earlier in the season, and I thought it would. I was fascinated by the conversation. I always am when it comes to interpreting the word and how the work that you do, and how the links that you go in order to check your interpretation. And I appreciate that. I think we all do. But I thought it would be interesting to kind of talk through this verse. I think this is one of the more confusing verses in our study this year as far as these whys and what they kind of go to. So I thought we could take a minute to kind of see how you interpret this verse when you're going to write a question on it, and what your process is. So, but we see Jesus, and then we have who was made a little lower than the angels. That's something that happened. And then we have for the suffering of death, which is clearly a why. And then we have another something that happened, crowned with glory and honor. Jesus was crowned with glory and honor. And then we have another why, that he, by the grace of God, should taste death for every man. Now, upon the first time I looked at this, I said, oh, Jesus was made a little lower than the angels. Why? And crowned with glory and honor. Why? But looking at other versions and starting to look into it a little more, I'm like, oh, that's not quite as clear as I thought it was. So I wanted to kind of get you to interpret this and your process in getting to your destination.
Well, from the get-go, let me say this. I will likely be released the next version of the points of interpretation within the next couple of weeks, certainly before I go on vacation. um, and before our January tournaments come up, and this will be included. So this was the first edition after the initial release. So yeah, it's the comma after for the suffering of death that I think really throws us.
Mm-hmm.
And the punctuation in the King James text is more helpful than not, but every once in a while you'll find something that just leads you down the wrong path. If it weren't there, or if it were placed after angels, then it would be a little easier, I think, to interpret this. Just that moving of the comma, we would understand it, right? If it read, who was made a little lower than the angels, comma, for the suffering of death crowned with glory and honor, then, oh, okay. So
Gotcha.
we trip up over the comma, really. And that's what it implies. It's for the suffering of death, he was crowned with glory and honor. Because he suffered and died, he was crowned with glory and honor, is what the
So
verse is saying.
if you say he was crowned with glory and honor, why? The answer would be for the suffering of death. And you said he was made a little lower than the angels. Why? The answer would be that he, by the grace of God, should taste death for every man.
I would have to go back and look at the point of interpretation. I had included it after our initial text. That second why, that he by the grace of God should taste death for every man, I think may actually include all of it. So you've got sort of a why nested inside of a why,
Mm-hmm.
right? So Jesus was made a little lower than the angels for the suffering of death crowned with glory and honor. Why? That he by the grace of God should taste death for every man.
Okay.
And I believe I should have been prepared, but I believe that's, it's sort of like a why inside of a why.
Gotcha.
That way.
And I'm sure the POI is going to be clear, so I don't want you to have to do all the work. And I understand, I understand what it's like to put in time and really get a verse and figure it out, and then you sleep quite a few times, and then you're like, I don't quite remember the details.
Well,
but
it's all those other verses going in that sort of force one out, I think.
right. But I'm glad it's in the POI, because I do think that this is one of the more confusing verses as far as what modifies what goes with what. So I'm glad to hear that, and I'm looking forward to seeing that. But thank you for taking the time to kind of talk through that. So really, other translations, and once again, that is where you would go first to try to understand this verse, right?
Yes, yeah, I would pull up multiple, like 6, 8 translations, more modern ones, maybe some more traditional ones, and make sure that there is a sort of consensus amongst them. And that will go a long way. I encourage probably coaches, certainly, it really falls to you to understand the verses so that you can convey that meaning to your quizzers. If quizzers are going to read a different translation for themselves, make sure it's something that is far enough away from the KJV so that they don't get any sort of wrong words slipped in there, right? Don't necessarily read the NKJV or the ESV. That's a little too close, I would say, to the KJV. Read something like, if you want, a real paraphrase, go to the Message or the NLT. And again, I'm not hanging everything on a single translation.
Right.
That's why I say in the multitude of translations, transliterations, paraphrases, there's safety.
Right. It's a great phrase. Great saying. Okay. So I was thinking about this one earlier too. Jesus was made what, or was he made how? A little lower than the angels. I was wondering about that. Like, how was he made? He was made a little lower than the angels.
Given the context, I'd probably accept either if a quizzer, but I wouldn't put the question word after the word made, probably, just so that they don't have to decide which is which. Mm-hmm. How is Jesus made? what was
Gotcha.
Jesus made? I sort of feel how sounds more appropriate, maybe.
Hmm.
I would have to play around with that, I think. But by including it, you know, to begin with and not, after, then you sort of alleviated their process
Right.
from, well, is it how, is it what, is it how, is it what? And then whichever one they choose, the other team's going to contest. That's not a how, it's a what. Yeah.
'Tis quizzing, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Next, let's see if I can get it. All right. I brought this one up because this is personal. It's only personal because this was a question that you read to my team in 2019, and we got it wrong because we only said three. This was in the round one finals, and I was astonished at the time it took for you to deliberate on this. So I was just curious about this one, and if you, I know you've ruled on a lot of questions since 2019. Okay, and I'm going back quite a ways. But the question was, you know, how many verses describe Jesus or Christ as a lamb, and what are they? That was the question. And my quizzer, perfect hit to win round one, and he says three of these. And he said Revelations, the Revelation one, the Isaiah one, and I think he said John 129, and he left out First Peter. And there was a lot of deliberation on it, and I don't know if you left out Lamb with the apostrophe S on accident, and that was deliberate, or if like Lamb's Book of Life is that describing Jesus as a lamb in a way that would make it essential to answer this question. Curious if I'm throwing you way back 7 years. I'm curious if are all four of these describing Jesus as a lamb, and if not, why? And if you remember that, you probably don't remember that, but if you remember what the deliberation was back then.
I don't. I mean, looking at this, it looks like four to me.
Okay.
He is brought as a lamb. Behold the Lamb of God. I mean, John's directly calling him a lamb. Peter playing off of that as of a lamb. The lambs, yeah. I mean, it looks like four to me.
Okay.
Again, I probably would set up the question with that exposition referring to Christ, and then go from there.
Right. Referring to Christ, how many verses describe him as a lamb?
Right.
And where are they? In that case,
yeah.
And this is every lamb in our study, so there's not like ones that don't. So it's a 4-time word, or yeah, well, it's not. It's a 3-time word, and then we have lamb with the apostrophe s. But
right, yeah.
Cool. Okay, I think that's all I need to share, but I do have a couple more questions for you, if you don't mind. Thank you for taking the time
Sure.
to come on today. It's been insightful, and I always enjoy. I try not to bother you too much, but then sometimes I just can't help myself at a tournament, and I just have questions. I just want to talk to you and get your thoughts on something. And thank you for always taking the time over the years to oblige and just withstand me as much as you will. I know when I typically come around and your wife's like, "Here's Phil again." That's great. All right, we're not going to lunch yet. But I love Kim, your wife, and getting to talk to you when we can. I try not to bother you. I really don't. I really do. But I've got a few questions for you. You have heard thousands of quoters, thousands of quotation questions at this point. And I have a quoter that his goal this year is to really improve as a quoter. There are some quoters that doesn't really matter what they do. The judges are going to the recorder. And then there's some quizzers that you never have to listen to the recorder. So I was curious if you have any advice or any insight into what sets apart great quoters from let's go to the recording.
You have to be intentional and practice it, even if that means maybe changing your cadence or I remember as a quizzer myself, I sort of took on a more robotic tone just so that I could enunciate a little more clearly. And it kind of sounded weird. It's not a conversational tone, but it served a purpose at the quiz board, you know. Um, so yeah, quizzers who project, when your material well, there's confidence in that, and you're quizzing by the Spirit unto the Lord, and so you're quoting with confidence. Quizzers who may be a little shaky usually are a little more timid in their approach in quoting the verses, and um, I think the most some quizzers will quote it even at the quiz board with faith, and you can feel that faith and anointing coming off of the quiz board even, and it doesn't happen every time they answer the buzzer necessarily, but there are moments where it's almost like God's trying to make a point through them, or he's speaking through them to somebody in the audience, or even to myself. Um, so yeah, speak it. This is the living, breathing word of God, speak it with faith and belief, all of those elements sort of come together to help improve quoting.
Amen. That's great. Okay, from your experience, what practical strategies would you recommend to quizzers that are looking for help to manage their anxiety, their nerves, their pregame stress? I'm curious if you had anything. I mean, and we know your nerves of steel. I'm sure you've never been nervous in your life, but any practical things. I mean, obviously there's a lot of spiritual application, but I'm curious on the spiritual side and on the practical side of things.
I come back to the last answer: practice. The more questions, the better you know your material, the more assurance that you have. And our assurance and confidence should not ultimately be placed in ourselves alone, right? If we're quizzing by the Spirit, God is helping us. He is. And so I'm not relying on myself alone. Otherwise, yeah. God is going to set me up for a hard lesson at some point, necessary,
Right.
But a hard lesson. So trusting Him as well through that will alleviate that burden. I don't feel when I come to church and the worship service begins and I'm raising my hands or I'm clapping my hands, I'm not feeling all this tenseness and anxiety and, oh, does my worship measure up to, do I sing as well as sister so-and-so who's, the lead vocalist in the choir, or do I raise my hands as high as so-and-so over here? I don't feel that because it's just worship unto the Lord. And so when you come to the quiz board and God, I've done my best. If you haven't done your best, then you need to ask God to forgive you and do your best, and everybody's best looks a little different. But if you come to the board, Lord, I'm coming to worship you. You're worthy of my best. I'm going to give it, and I'm open to whatever lessons that you have to learn or to teach me, for me to learn. That sort of takes the pressure off you that you have to somehow produce, points or, correct answers at the board. So that certainly helped me as a quizzer. It helped me as a coach, so that I wasn't, on my quizzers. This is not baseball or football, right? This is Bible quizzing. It's a different type of, it's a spirit-filled competition. Um, so yeah, from the practical, lots of practice, lots of questions, and typically these are things you will adopt in life as well. If you find, young person, if you find that you're dealing with anxiety and uh, uh, with a lot of different areas. If you work it through in Bible quizzing in an environment that's safe and supportive, then those same habits will transpose into your academics. It will transpose into your relationships and social scene, this sort of thing. So we do our young people a disservice if we're going to, well, they've come up against something hard or something they're uncomfortable with, so we're just going to withdraw it, or we're going to remove every obstacle, or we're just going to, well, we won't require them to press on and press through. We're setting our young people, if that's our approach, we're setting our young people up for a whole lot bigger issues years down the road.
Okay. Thank you. I've actually been fascinated lately, YouTube rabbit holes with like sports science, like anxiety, like how like athletes deal with anxiety, and trying to see how we could potentially take some of those things and kind of reapply them in a spiritual sense. In a reply. And one thing that I was listening to recently was talking about reframing. And like anxiety a lot of times occurs because you're thinking about something that happened in the past or something that might happen in the future. Like, I hope we win this quiz, or like, gosh, I really hope I don't miss these. I really hope I don't air out. Right? That's anxiety, right? But reframing is noticing when you have those thoughts and reframe, like consciously reframing that thought in your mind, and instead of saying I hope I don't air out, reframe every time you think that, reframe that to say, I want the Lord's will in this next quiz. Or instead of saying I really hope we win, saying I pray that me and my teammates and the other team, we give our best into the Lord. And if that reframing is a great life tool, much more than Bible quizzing. Yeah. But anytime you have those thoughts, have conscious reframing, and a lot of it talks about being present, like not being worried about the future, not being thinking about something in the past. But a lot of them talk about like focusing on your breathing, like focus on your breathing and be here now in the present. And I really think there's a lot of really interesting applications with that, especially when listening for the voice of God, in the present moment, not worried about the future, not thinking about the past. And I think, Esther Tabua from a 2 years back, and she's talked about how during nationals she was just constantly quoting the word between quizzes, just like the whole day. The whole day she was quizzing, she was quoting the word. And what does that do? That kind of keeps you from worrying about the next quiz, about thinking about the future, about thinking about the mistake you made last quiz. That was, in my opinion, keeping her rooted right now in the present. I think there's a lot to that, and it's something I'm chewing on a little bit and trying to kind of think about coach application and how to try to help. Because I have we have a new quizzer this year, a first year quizzer that has admitted to dealing, that she really feels like she's going to deal with a lot of anxiety at the quiz board. She hasn't had a real quiz yet, and I have total faith and confidence that she's going to do great. But just trying to think of ways to help quizzers like that we don't want fear to steal anything from our quizzers in a quiz or at our tournament. Fear is not of God, and if it's not of God, where's it coming from? We don't want anything to do with it. So, okay.
Yeah, amen to all of
that. This is a question that I think is interesting to ask, and I hope that I'm sure you have a lot of answers to this, but I'm curious what you would want to share today. You've been the national quizzing director since 2018. As the first year, I believe you took over as the head guy. So in that time, and you're heavily involved way before that, obviously. But what is the most meaningful aspect of serving the quizzing community in your position? What is the most rewarding, meaningful part of that?
Um,
I'm sure there's some parts of it that you could live without.
yeah, certainly. You yeah. Um, I would say seeing families drawn together around the Word, you know, um, see families traveling together, prioritizing the Word. Every year I'm overwhelmed at our prayer and share. First by the testimonies of our last year quizzers and their choice to be vulnerable in front of 1,000 people, live stream and everything, just incredible. But then to see families and quiz teams and churches praying together, and I know we pray together in our churches. I hope we pray together in our churches and in our homes. Um, but I think the quiz ministry is tightening that bond and really preparing these young people. Um, I always get a little overwhelmed as well, and I think the possibilities that God is going to tease out of these the lives of these young men and women. Um, yeah, I I don't necessarily do it for those reasons. I feel like those are wonderful byproducts. I really feel the ministry, God, His Word, the ministry, quizzing so many people whose fingerprints were on my life when I was a young man involved in ministry. I just feel that so much was invested in me. I've got, I'm compelled to give back and to help others and pay it forward.
I
As they
I
say.
can relate
So
to that. I can relate to that
yeah,
a lot. As a coach, I've had so many coaches that have poured so much into me that I'm so thankful for. And who am I to withhold any of that knowledge and understanding that was imparted to me? Um, so, but thank you for sharing that, Brother Faubert. That
yeah,
was
certainly.
um. All right, I got one question about last season and one question about next season. Then we'll be done. So,
All right.
question about last season. Many people regard our past year's championship finale as one of the best finals that they've witnessed. So curious what your takes on that final quiz of the year, and how you felt about the year as a whole.
Um, well, yeah, I think that quiz was definitely one for the ages. That was incredible. It sort of went back and forth there
I
several times.
actually
So
went and
whenever
looked. I went and
you
looked at the
know,
score sheet, and Florida had the lead coming out of had a decent lead in the tens, and then Missouri came back and had the lead early in the 20s, and then Florida came back and had a good lead at the end of the 20s, and then Missouri came back to tie it, and then Florida. So it really was like a total back and forth the whole way.
yes, yeah, and I think you felt that sort of that it was like this tug of war, almost like back and forth like that, and even folks sensed it, in the audience, and that's. I mean, I've had finals where it was over by question 14 and they quizzed phenomenally and cleanly. And that's not to take anything away from anyone's national championship. I mean, uh, it is extremely hard to get there and to achieve that. So, but yeah, just the dynamics of that quiz were incredible. Um, um, and I can't speak for how the quizzers were feeling in that moment, but I know I felt just such a peace as a quiz master. And that's not always the case. Sometimes, my adrenaline's going and I'm living and dying with the quizzers at the quiz board. And I pray and like focus. Let me just get through one more question, Lord, and then one more question after that. But I, oddly enough, and maybe as you said, I've done this long enough that I never want to treat it cavalierly or nonchalantly, but there was just such a peace and a fluidity to it as well that I think I just chalked that up to the presence and power of the Lord uh, in that quiz room. It was whoever won that quiz. Uh, we were I mean, yeah, you could cheer for both sides. So,
I certainly was cheering for both. It was really hard. I
mhm.
mean, I loved all the quizzers up there. Just fantastic quizzers, fantastic coaching, fantastic people all around. Just it was just great. I don't really think there were any losers that quiz.
No, no.
Um, but what about the year as a whole? How did you feel like the life of Jesus, early life of Jesus material and the quizzing and the quality? I'm tired of, these LeBron versus Michael Jordan conversations about like eras of quizzing. Like I really think that you can't really compare quizzers from 7 years apart. I've heard some conversation about who's the best. Who cares? Let's focus on the quizzers we have now, and let's admire the hard work and the effort that they're putting in. But curious what you thought about just the quality of quizzing, the work that quizzers have put in, and the material, and just the year as a whole.
I thought the quizzes responded really well. I had a lot of great quizzes, and points scored at a quiz board are certainly not the only barometer, but when they seem to do well and respond to the questions and the material, that is part of the metric that you might use. And I think that was certainly on display throughout the quiz season. Every time we do a new study, like we'd never done in almost 60 years of Bible quizzing, we had never done this particular study before. So it's you always want to see how it turns out. I felt it was received well. The layout, we tried to structure the material, and every study has got some things that are easier about it and harder about it, and there were elements of that in this year's study as well. I thought early on it was kind of neat, and I'd hoped that this would be the case. So it was nice to see that come to fruition. That quizzers who had started learning prior to the holidays, they already had those verses down, and I saw a number of churches incorporate the
Mm-hmm.
quiz ministry into their Christmas program.
Right.
Because they're quoting these same verses that they learned. So I thought that was great for the ministry to give it that visibility within a local church or beyond. And so, yeah, I thought overall it was a neat course of study that way, and it presented not everyone was familiar with the concept of a harmony, where you
Mm-hmm.
take all the four of the Gospels and sort of try to put them together chronologically. So I think it may have opened that up to some folks who weren't familiar with it.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the chronological going back, having the different books. I thought it was great. It was different. It's not just one book. It was different. When you have different books and different writers, you have different styles of verses, which lends itself to different styles of questions, and that's great for Bible quizzing because we like variety every once in a while. So
Mm-hmm.
okay, so that brings us to this coming up season, 2026, which is so crazy to say that out loud that we're a month away from 2026. But what do you think is special about quizzing on doctrine, and what are you looking forward to in 2026?
Well, the doctrine study is definitely a challenging study. It has historically, now I don't think that's the case this year because we sort of massaged the verse counts and sort of we cut some material, added a little material. So it's slightly different than any of the doctrinal studies we've done before. All the core verses are there, and it is always such a challenge when it comes to trimming material. Um, but be that as it may, um, I think two things are big takeaways from the doctrinal study. One, it's so important for our young people to ground themselves in an apostolic identity. Most of evangelical Christendom does not rely so heavily on doctrine, which sort of sets us apart as apostolics. We certainly got some things that overlap, and we can have certain elements that we share. But in terms of the focus on doctrine, the importance of doctrine, I think that's, and not only saying, "Oh, well, my pastor says this or believes this, or my parents," or you're internalizing it. You're adopting this apostolic identity for yourself, and the the outgrowth of that is to then be able to turn around and articulate it,
Mm-hmm.
right? To be able to share it, and so that was certainly one of the things that when we sort of, as the Bible quizzing team, we came together, and the theme of "Ready Always" was presented. I was like, I mean, that's so strong, you
Mm-hmm.
know. That's really, it speaks to the whole point of carrying this and being ready always. So yeah, those two things really make the doctrine study unique that way. It certainly draws a lot more participation each year as well, which I always find a little bemusing, but I am thankful for it. And the more young people that we get, learning the Word of God, memorizing these core doctrinal scriptures, then the better, certainly.
I know you had there was a reel recently that released that where you were on video saying that you've sold more material this year, and it seems like it really that which is a signal that we're going to have real growth this year, which is really exciting. The more churches we have quizzing, the better, and we love adding new ministries, and I really feel passionate about helping those churches, and I hope that every district has a Darren Venus like I did. A coach that is willing to really impart knowledge and wisdom to these younger coaches, these younger ministries, and help get them up. Because if there's other teams in your district that are good with Bible quizzing, that just makes your team better. That just makes that's iron sharpens iron, and
Mm-hmm.
and not only that, that is enriching their lives, the quizzers' lives, the coaches' lives, by really figuring out, because Bible quizzing can be tough to figure out if you're kind of on an island and you don't know, maybe you didn't quiz when you were younger, or maybe you don't have somebody that's coached before, or anything like that. It can be tough to step into, and I really encourage everybody that is stepping into it this year to stick with it. We have resources that are great. I'm not going to start naming resources, but there is a lot of great resources for you to learn. There's a lot of people, um, I would put myself in that are willing to help in any way to help your ministries take off. And what we want is what's best for our quizzers, and to learn doctrine, put it in your heart, share it, and live it. So,
Yeah.
Brother Faubert, thank you so much for taking the time. I'm really excited to start 2026. We're not far. Every year it flies by, but it's such a wonderful journey each and every time, and it feels like I blink and it's prayer and share.
Mm, yes.
But
Well, try doing it for 40 years.
well, if
Yeah,
the
it
Lord
always
tarries,
speeds up, and I sometimes I want to keep everything discrete and be able to catalog all of these memories and the year and the every. I just given up at this point. I think it was somewhere around something like that.
well, you can always ask Chad. He knows. I mean, your
There
brother
you go.
or Chad Nash, either one. They probably remember. They're
Hmm.
encyclopedias. So, well, thank you, sir, for your time, and thank you for your ministry and the effort that you put in, and for leading this ministry that we love. So it's not something that I take for granted, or others should. So, thank you, sir, and we'll talk to all of you at a later time. God bless.
All right. God bless.